Hi and hello watch fans, and welcome to another edition of the Real Time Show. Today we will be analysing the Audicle by our resident provocateur David Vaucher, this time focused on two of the Swatch Group's flagship brands, Omega and Longines, and their current states of play. So David, I'm going to kick this over to you immediately to give us a succinct breakdown of the points you were making so we have a good starting point for this discussion.
All right, Rob, Alan, always great to be here with you. And, just to give the listeners a little bit of a peek behind the curtain, I heard feedback from Rob and Alan that this might not have been my most impactful article, which is strange because I thought I was being super clever when I wrote this, and definitely when I came up with the title, which was the Alpha and the Omega of the Swatch Group. And I thought I was actually being very provocative because, at the Real Time Show, as the name says, we keep it real for you. Which means not pulling any punches. And essentially, the points that I was trying to make here were threefold. The first was that Omega just seems lost. This is the brand that I love. I've owned many of their watches in the past. I definitely have at least one on my radar in the future. So I love the brand, but they just seem lost. I don't understand what they're doing. On the flip side, Longines, which is another heritage brand, I think is doing extremely well, and it's very clear what they're doing. But at the same time, this kind of leads to the third overarching point, which is that to the extent that these are both in the Swatch Group, and Omega is a cash cow. I don't know if it's the biggest because there's not much granularity in their financials, but I question what Swatch Group does. And I know that in conversations with you two, I know that it's a bit of a black box, but I can't really get any logic from this other than kind of what I'm seeing in front of me. So I guess I would just start out with both of you because you both have experience with Omega, both working for them and selling them. What has historically been your impression of Omega? And do you think that has changed recently? So Rob, maybe you go first.
Well, historically, I would say that the brand has always been, while I've been working for it in the past at least, a little bit in Rolex's shadow. I think that it was very obvious to those of us on the inside that the brand was playing catch-up in many ways, mostly in reputational ways, because at one point in time, the brand's price points were not too dissimilar. And then, of course, the Rolex phenomenon really took off in the 2010s, I guess, and it streaked away from Omega in terms of desirability, the idea that its products were an asset class of their own, even separate from the conversation as to whether luxury watches are or should ever have been classed as such. And Omega has since been trying to claw back that lost ground. And you can understand its frustration, I think the frustration of its owners, because Omega clearly is the jewel in the Swatch Group crown, I would say. Yes, there are better brands like Blancpain and Breguet, and you could say Harry Winston at one point or another as well in its past, but I think Omega is the brand that has the most on-the-street recognition. If you ask somebody passing by to name three watch brands, undoubtedly they would say Rolex. Beyond that, I don't know what I'd put my money on. Maybe Omega, maybe Tag Heuer would probably come in second and third. And that is frustrating for Omega because Omega has always seen itself on a par with Rolex in terms of the products it outputs. I don't think that's actually true in the past, at least, but they're certainly trying to improve the product offering and in that process increase the prices quite drastically. And that has maybe created the situation that resulted in your Audicle, that Longines, a brand that has also excellent name recognition, is ubiquitously stocked in high street retailers, has made an incredible amount of hay in a particular entry-level price point, now has a bit more wiggle room to get creative with its own model line and create pieces that now take the place of the Omegas that are elevated beyond that price point. And by that, I'm talking the 2 to 5K bracket that Omega is rapidly departing.
Thank you, David, for writing the article and recording it. I always enjoy listening to them as one of the members of the TRTS network. I said indeed to David in the backstage studio, I'm like, dude, I liked it, but what point were you driving as our in-house provocateur? And what threw me off was the title. I didn't get what he meant by from Alpha to Omega, because David apparently thinks that Longines is the alpha in the Swatch Group, and I respectfully disagree. But before I elaborate on why I disagree, maybe if you two gentlemen and dear listeners have a moment, I think we should go down the rabbit hole of history, both for the two brands and maybe all brands within the Swatch Group, and discuss Swatch Group very briefly. But before I do so, David, you are the numbers guy usually, but I'm going to take that hat from you. In the startup world, we call a company that either has a valuation of 1 billion, a unicorn, or if they have turnover of 1 billion, a unicorn. Now, that analogy goes as well for the watchmaking industry. There are not that many watch brands that have 1 billion turnover or even market cap. It's very difficult to find out because, as you said, rightfully so, David, the big groups or any Swiss watch brand is not that open. They're very secretive. And those that are publicly listed usually do not publish the turnover per maison or brand that they own. The only one where you could guess how much about is within Richemont because they split watchmaking brands and the jewelry brands, and they don't have that many jewelry brands. So you could almost guess how much turnover Cartier does. But the annoying thing is they make watches under the Cartier brand, and that's incorporated into the category jewelry houses. So long story short, if we need benchmarking, Swatch Group last year did just over 8 billion Swiss francs turnover. Looking back 20 years, data from 2001, it was almost 5 billion. They dipped to 3 billion the year after, and then started a stellar growth, peaking in 2013 at almost 10 billion, dipped again 16, went up again. 22 wasn't that good, 6+ billion. If you think about it, Swatch Group has, I believe, 13 brands, but I need to check that. They obviously make a lot of money with subcontracting. What do I mean by that? ETA movements, for example, Nivarox hairsprings, Renata batteries. They don't solely make their money by selling finished watches. They are a big supplier to the industry. If, and this is an hypothesis, watch brands within the Swatch Group are unicorns, and I mean by that they reach annually 1 billion in turnover, they technically can't have 8 because the total turnover is 8 billion. That being said, people assume insiders info is that Omega is a unicorn, Longines made it, Tissot made it, and that's it. Taking that analogy, David, you're kind of right. Longines is kind of an alpha, but within the perception of the Swatch Group board, Omega is always the alpha of the group. And then in prestige, brand equity, goodwill, Swatch Group literally has a pyramid. Dear listeners, you can Google it. Just Google the Swatch Group pyramid, where they stack the brands in a hierarchy of value and prestige and exclusivity, where the peak of everything is Harry Winston, Léon Hatteau, Breguet, Blancpain, and then close runner-ups are Glasuto Original and Omega. But the most known, obviously, is Omega, because Rob, you rightfully said so, that Omega always has this stigma or Calimero effect that they feel inferior to Rolex. But within the Swatch Group universe, it's their number one. And I think it's the number one, both in brand recognition and turnover per single business unit within the Swatch Group. Why I do like your title, David, the funny thing is, before Second World War, Longines had a bigger brand name and exclusivity and reputation in quality and chronometry than Omega. They didn't belong to the same group back then. For those that are not aware, Mr. Hayek Sr., late Nick Hayek, the father of the current CEO, he formed the SMH group after the quartz crisis. He came on board as a consultant. He got asked to help out the Swiss watch industry. As a consultant, he advised many groups and brands to work together to create synergy. And at a certain point with investors, he became a shareholder as well. And that's where the group SMH started. And that's the initial name of the Swatch Group. And within this group, with ETA as well as part of that consolidation, they started Swatch. And that apparently was not only the messiahs and the sole rescuer of the whole Swiss watch industry, but definitely also for the shareholders of SMH and the Hayek family. Now, Longines and Omega suffered from the quartz crisis. It's very noteworthy that Longines made epic calibers, in-house calibers, whereas today they don't. And obviously, Longines is famous for example, the Lindbergh angle, our angle watch. Think about Longines as well supplying RAF, many militaries. They have a strong ties in aviation and stunning designs as well. It's important to know that within the strategy within Swatch Group, Omega is stacked on top of Longines. So Longines can never make better watches than Omega. Whatever better means, right? Better in image, better in quality, better in chronometry, in-house movements, better technology, simply better looking watches. So whatever definition you want to use for that. And with that disadvantage, Longines in this strategy and this constellation in the Swatch Group can never be the alpha compared to the brand Omega. So therefore, David, sorry for the long rant. I do not agree with your title.
But basically what you said are facts. Like Omega is on top of the pyramid. But then my question is, why is it being mismanaged? And I know that's kind of a loaded thing. And I know I love to pretend play CEO on this show. But let's look at the last couple of releases, right, from Omega. So off the top of my head, this is fresh off the press from yesterday. We have the Apollo 8 Saturn V. Before that, we had the Planet Ocean with the titanium movement. Before that, we had the Speedmaster Racing with the admittedly very cool spy rate system. And then before that, we had kind of a whole range of like blue dialed watches across the spectrum. I guess my question is, how do you market all this? Like, who is this? They're very cool watches technically. I'm not going to argue with that. But where's the cohesion behind that? Omega is supposed to be the mass market driver. So on one hand, I would very much accept if someone said, okay, these larger watches are test beds for smaller, more mass market watches that come out. But at the same time, where's my 36 millimeter ceramic Aquaterra then in that case, right? And then if you look at Longines, they're just giving the people what they want, like hit after hit. Like you had, I think it's the Spirit Collection, the 5-star, which I love. Then, it was like the titanium one. And then there's a flyback chronograph. And then there's the Zulu time. And then there's a 39 millimeter Zulu time because the 42 millimeter was apparently too large for some people. So this is a brand that, like you said, had a huge amount of history. I think then kind of pulled back towards a maker of dress watches, predominantly selling very well in the Far East, is my understanding. And now, maybe coincidentally with the changing of guard, because Longines had a very long-serving CEO, they've just like broken out and they're just firing on all cylinders. So even though I understand in absolute terms, Omega is still larger than Longines, just the momentum seems to be going in two totally separate directions. Alan, what do you think?
I agree with you, and they are indeed on fire, but I think both brands are on fire. I do think both are making many mistakes, but you just used the word mismanagement. So did you mean that Omega is mismanaging things and Longines isn't?
Yeah, that's exactly what that was the whole point of the article. Was it just seems like there's no strategy. It's almost like at Omega, someone's like, hey, this is cool. We should try this. And one point I'll just sneak in, Alan, before turning it back to you, is, we talked about our predictions for 2024 a couple weeks ago, and that was kind of fun. And AI had generated them. But my personal prediction is, I think the hangover is coming. I think there's a lot of watches in the market, and I think demand's going to pull back. And if Omega is just putting out these very, marginal technical showcases rather than that mass market, I think they might get punished for it. Whereas Longines definitely has kind of these mass market watches that people will snap up, I think. So just from a positioning point of view, as the market starts to cool, I think Longines is better positioned than Omega to weather that.
several hypotheses there. So we as watch nerds think that both brands are being mismanaged. Well, I think so. So Omega is making a mistake in our collector's opinion, that they're asking too much money and pushing the prices up too extremely, and maybe they're making it too much of a fashion brand. We discussed in length the summer colors for the Seamaster collections, the Apollo Saturn V that was launched recently, pushing it up 5K just because it has a rocket functioning as a second hand, that kind of stuff. Now, Longines get criticized by collectors because they have an amazing archive and historical pieces, but they don't make them spot on. My personal criticisms, I love the Spirit collection, but I have no effing clue why they put the 5 stars on there, because historically they weren't there. We don't know what it refers to. Commercially, they're good products, although I think they're pushing them up in price too fast, too much, because I believe the most recent chronograph is around 6,000 euros retail. But I'm using this as a segue. So Omega, like Rob rightfully said so, mirrors itself to Rolex. Rolex is moving up market. Omega thinks they're at the same level. Probably technically they are maybe even better, movement-wise. They feel obliged to follow that strategy. And let's make one thing clear. The Hayeks and all Swatch Group shareholders, not stakeholders, shareholders, have one mission: as much possible ROI per year. So they want the maximum dividends per stock per year. That's a different KPI than Rob, David, and I have, or any other collector, or any other stakeholder. The Hayeks love Breguet, love Omega, and Swatch, and all the other ones are cash cows. And that's why we sometimes maybe think that there is lack of strategy. Now, Papa Hayek, his baby was Breguet, and you saw that the brand grew to great heights, and now they're a bit all over the place. And I think you can summarize that in the fact that Type 20s have date wheels on them. Some think there's no problem with that, and it was a good decision. Hardcore collectors think it's sacrilege. I mean, it should have never been done. But that shows that they're all over the place, right? I mean, probably, and I agree with you, Rob, we like to play what if CEO games. Probably the three of us would come to a consensus within 3 minutes that you should make a true to historical values replica of a Type 20 and an extreme modern one. And that should have been maybe the most logical, commercial, and brand equity worthy strategy. Now, going back to Longines and Omega, Longines fills the gap that Omega leaves behind. And that's also a Swatch Group strategy. If we rephrase it or turn it upside down 180 degrees, Longines actually has a lot to thank to Omega because they're moving up market, trying to catch up with Rolex or whomever. They can fill that gap, and that gives them an automatic success by creating more turnover because they're making more expensive pieces. They do get exclusive ETI calibers designated to the Longines brand, but they're still not, I wouldn't call them manufactured. Regarding Omega, I wanted to say last thing and then I'll shut up. I mean, I would love to have Rob tune in. I believe that Omega is following the right strategy if they are trying to catch up with Rolex. I'm not saying that's the right strategy. I think they should focus on their own brand universe and just do their thing, and then you'll be amazing. But Swatch Group does look at that, and that being hunting Rolex. I believe that Rolex is so mythical and epic, king on top of the hill. The only way forward is to beat them with technology. And that's what Omega is doing. So in that context, if that's a given, I think it's the right strategy. And now I'll shut up. Rob, what do you want to say?
Oh man, I want to say a lot, but I don't know where to start. I've been listening for the last 15 minutes and I agree with a lot of what's been said, but I think there's a nuance to these strategies that we probably should be analyzing a little more closely. So firstly, I think there's a massive symmetry here with Omega and Longines, with Rolex and Tudor. So as Rolex elevated its prices to meet or match or exceed perhaps the demand, or to create it maybe is more accurate, Tudor started to fill the gap that Rolex left behind. We see that quite clearly. Now Omega is, I think, quite clearly trying to get its prices up towards Rolex because it believes they should be on a par. And that has also excavated a space into which Longines is pouring. I thought the point about Omega doing this by focusing on technical advancements is very good, and also something that Omega probably should do, because I don't think that its brand cachet is overnight going to overtake Rolex. I don't agree at all that Omega is a fashion brand, despite the wealth of references in the collection. I think that they really will have more success if they push their innovations and use those, the technical innovations and material innovations, the decorative innovations, as the justification for the elevation in prices that gets them to the point they feel they should be operating at. But there are different ways to move a brand into new price points. And I think that what Omega and Longines have done simultaneously are very, very different things. So Longines has created new collections to occupy these now vacant price points. The Spirit line was an enormous release for the brand. It didn't exactly hit the ground running, in my opinion, but I think it's really picked up speed. I think it's wonderful now. I think there's a great many exciting options within it. That was clever, because that was a brand releasing a collection that had no previous ties to a price point. And so it wasn't like, oh man, have you seen how expensive a new Spirit model is? You're like, oh, that's a good quality watch that's been released at a pretty fair price from a brand with a great deal of prestige. Nicely done. That's very different to Omega expanding the Seamaster 300M collection with special editions here and there. Like we had the James Bond No Time to Die model, which was justifiably more expensive because of its titanium case and its different profile crystal and so on and so forth. And then we had the Necton that also sat significantly above the other models for whatever reason they gave. And then we had the 75th anniversary collection that you could argue is a bit fashion-ish, but it was at least a new technique with dials, PVD coatings on ceramic dials. I don't think I've ever seen that before to create that effect. So technical reasons for increases in prices. But the problem with that is all of those new models have old models in the collection that you can point to and say they used to cost less than 5,000 euros. Now, a Seamaster 300M is over 6,000 euros, which is a lot of money. Now, I think that going for a repositioning of price point makes sense if you don't make it too bloody obvious what you're doing. And I think it's a real shame that Omega has done this with existing models like the Spirate technology, the 75th anniversary collections, the Apollo 8, which, to be honest, that one's a real kick in the nuts for Speedmaster fans because 15,300 euros, I believe it is, around that. That's a lot for the Saturn V rocket. I'll say one more thing and then kick it back over to David. Since the release of all of those seminal models that David mentioned before, all of the pieces we've seen come out that put Omega's technology front and center, I've been to Omega boutiques 10, 15 times, looking to mainly try on the new Ploprof in the older dimensions. And I've not seen a single one of those 75th anniversary pieces. I've not seen a single Spirate Speedmaster. And I question how many of these pieces Omega has actually made. Because here's the other thing you can do when you announce a new release. You can throw a lot of stuff at the wall and see what sticks. Now, Omega might be thinking, what seems to us looks like a shotgun approach, bit of a scattershot, blunderbuss strategy. Just shoot it all off and see what people buy, and then quietly discontinue the stuff that people don't buy. That could be happening here. They could have said, all right, we're going to release these kind of ambitious models that sit at a price point that expands the collection upwards in that direction, but we don't actually expect to operate at. We expect, because there's a higher price point now on the catalog, that we'll sell more pieces around the 6,000 range, like the Moon Watch, for example, because it now seems like a bargain. And people will now be thinking, shit, I better buy the classic core models before they too elevate to 8, 9, 10,000 to match up with Rolex. So there could be another strategy at play there where this collection, and David, I agree, both catalogs are way too big. This collection is expanding in Omega's sense in a very broad and seemingly disparate fashion so they can identify where their most success is going to come from in the future. Meanwhile, Longines have it much easier because they've created new model lines and they can easily discontinue entire model lines, chop out huge portions of the catalog, and totally reposition the brand a couple of grand higher than it was.
You both went into this thinking, what am I going to say? And it turns out we could spend 3 hours talking about this, right? I guess, so many things to reply to. I think, look, in terms of, again, just let's look at, several things. And Alan said a very important word earlier, hypothesis. This is all hypothesis. We don't have data. I wish we did. But based on what we can tell, let's talk model lines first. Longines it's not just the Spirit. It's the Hydra Conquest coming back. It's the Zulu Time. It's the very high precision Ultrachron. It's just everything has been reevaluated seemingly to have maximum impact. Whereas Omega, if your hypothesis is correct, and they're just kind of putting mock-ups together and maybe not selling them eventually, right? Or mock-ups, I use that term loosely, but like a prototype or two, that's not really very befitting of a company like Omega. And if technology is how they're going to sell things, 2 points there. The first is that, you don't sell luxury watches on features, you sell them on feelings. And if you look at Rolex, like no one who buys a Rolex really cares what a parachrome hairspring is. I don't think. They just think about the crown. So if Omega is going to go on technology, that's fine. They can do that. But I think they need to take care of the nuts and bolts first. So for example, I mentioned a 36 millimeter ceramic Aquaterra. Like, why do you have to diffuse the spirate technology in one watch? Why do you have to diffuse, the coaxial elsewhere, or all of them? But why do you have to diffuse all of these separate technologies into different watches? Why can't you just kind of try them out, go through the usual R&D process that large companies do, and then introduce your 36 millimeter Aquaterra with the spirate system, the coaxial, the ceramic? And, when we talk about like Omega wanting to be Rolex, that's just one other aspect to this, because there's a flip side as well I want to talk about. They released their shades, Aquaterra, right? The colored dials, that was the big thing. First of all, it just seemed not very befitting of a company like Omega to so blatantly say like, hey, we want to be like Rolex. But the second thing, and this is what ties into your point, Rob, is that like these didn't really show up in cases for a long time. So that to me says there might be some operational issues here that just would never happen at Rolex on that scale. So am I missing something, Rob or Alan, when I say that? Or is it the case that there might be something going on behind the scenes where the delivery is just not keeping up with the promises?
I don't know about that. I honestly think that there's a key point here when we look at these releases. How many of those key releases from Omega that you referenced are actually limited to a certain number?
Off the top of my head, I would say none. I don't think any of them are limited.
Off the top of my head, I would say the same. I believe that they are termed limited production models, which is kind of how they approached the Omega Speedmaster Snoopy 3, the 50th anniversary version. Now, that's a key point to analyze in the communication strategy. When you don't limit a model to a number, you remove not just the FOMO from the buyers, but also the necessary sellout, which is something that many brands were concerned about for obvious reputational risk reasons. Now, Nick Hayek has been saying for the last 4 years, at least, to my knowledge, and I have this from the horse's mouth, that he doesn't want to do as many limited editions of Omegas. Now, there's two reasons I can see, obviously, for not wanting to do limited editions. One is a very just and pure reason, and that is, I want our watches to sell because they're good watches. I want people that want to be able to buy good watches to be able to buy them when they want to. I want to focus on core models and building a responsible, sustainable range that carries the Omega brand into its next phase of development. Fine. Second reason is that if the market collapses, which it has done now, the pressure upon brands to sell out models limited to a specific number is massive. If they don't sell out quick enough, they'd be forced into a position where they would probably very seriously consider marking the model as sold out just to save face. Now, if you do limited production, you can mess with the numbers however you want. You can have a model that hasn't sold a single piece in a collection playing a role, like I said, to stretch the catalog's price point. And you can decide how many of those pieces you want to deliver to maybe create a sense of artificial scarcity to drive up the interest in the product. What Omega is doing could be, and I don't know for sure, but it could be a strategy built around increasing the perceived value and desirability and scarcity of its models by positioning them at a point that its existing client base is unwilling to stretch to. What do you think, David?
It's a fair point what you're saying. The halo effect is something we see in a lot of industries, and I've referred to the bell curve a couple times on these types of podcasts. Just to give a concrete example, I think the original Apollo 8, that's a phenomenal watch. That thing existing makes me happy because it just so encompasses what Omega can do, like with the ceramic case and the laser bladed movement on the back to look like the moon. I mean, the whole thing is just phenomenal. So I think it's fantastic that exists. I see your point, Rob, about using that as an anchor upwards on pricing. But what I was trying to say in the original article, and this is something to take it back to Longines, that Longines is doing, is that Omega doesn't have like the bread and butter stuff taken care of. I mean, if you look at the complaints for their lines that you hear all the time, right? The Planet Ocean is too thick. I don't want to go into too thick or not too thick, but that's something that a lot of people say, right? So the Planet Ocean is too thick. The Aquaterras, there needs to be a smaller model. So 38 is the smallest one for the men's watches. Those are quite thick. So could you do a return to the mid-size 36 millimeter? There's a complaint and a concern from owners that the Seamaster 300 meter is being diluted relative to something like the Rolex Submariner line because of limited editions coming out seemingly every week, right? And then on top of that, you have these very separate, technically specific models that are coming out. I mean, just again, taking this back to a financial operations perspective, like how do you market them? Because that seems like a catch-22. I understand what you're saying, Rob, about you keep them limited, you don't manufacture them until the demand is there, but the demand won't be there until you market them. And for something like the Apollo 8 with the Saturn V rocket, that's going to be an exceedingly small demand in the first place. So there's just a lot of things here that I cannot square away, and that would make a lot more sense if, rather than seeing the Apollo 8 Saturn V, we'd seen a whole revamp of the Aquaterra line. Rob, what do you think?
Yeah, a revamp of Aquaterra line would have been nice. A white Speedmaster would have been nice. I loved the term anchor up. I think that's a brilliant way to describe what I'm trying to describe there. To your point about marketing, I actually would say you market those watches, the ones that you may not expect to sell, heavier than you market anything else in the collection, because they add perceived value to the brand of Omega. And they also light a fire under people that have been sitting on their hands maybe for the last couple of years and have been watching the Speedmaster Moonwatch go up in price quite rapidly. I must say that the tangible improvements to the recent release of the Moonwatch are actually really good. And I do think that that's a fairly priced watch. I don't want to see it go any higher at all. But if I'm sitting there thinking, oh my God, you have to pay XYZ for a new Ploprof now, what's going to happen to the Speedmaster when Omega realizes that, people will buy that Ploprof? Because nobody knows what the sales of those heavily marketed, extremely expensive, technologically advanced remakes of existing models is actually going to be. They're never going to know. They have no idea. Swatch Group can control it because they're not limited. They can't speculate. Nobody can speculate. I just want to make one tangential admission, and it's to Longines' credit. There was a recent special edition released with Hodinkee. It was the Longines Spirit Zulu Time, and it is in 39mm. And it has a very obvious, I think, twin on the market at the moment, and that's the Tudor Black Bay Pro, the Rolex Explorer 2 homage. And the funny thing is, if you remember rightly, I was quite devastated by the release of the BB Pro and thought it was just too cheap a move for Tudor to do to align itself as the baby Rolex even more obviously through a product release. But ironically, I adore the Longines Spirit Zulu Time, even though I'm not blind to its incredible similarity to the BB Pro. I like the sizing of it. I like the layout. I like the Arabic numerals. I like the sort of vintage yellow color scheme. I'd call it athletic gold, I suppose, if I was choosing a name for that color. But I think it's absolutely fantastic. And I'm aware that people might chew me out for this because I was so against the BB Pro, but that's because I didn't like its position within the Rolex group, as we've started to call it with the addition of Bucherer. But for the Longines Spirit line, this to me is the maturation of that concept and the best watch they've actually ever released. And yeah, it is a Hodinkee special edition, but amazingly, I think it's still available, which is maybe not so surprising given the current climate. But, you know, Hodinkee editions used to sell out in a heartbeat. And this is a really, really nice piece. And there's only 500 of them being made, apparently. And if anyone's looking for a good solid GMT 39 millimeters, I'd say that's one to check out.
Yeah, and you know, I totally agree. And you know, when you mentioned Tudor again, and it's a thought I had when you first mentioned it in the episode. You know, Rolex and Tudor seem to be completely in sync with each other. And with you mentioning Tudor, like Tudor is the Black Bay company. For better or for worse, I would argue for better. It seems to be working. But like, I just had another idea for a product. I mean, instead of a 42 millimeter only Seamaster 300M, rather than churning out limited editions of the same form factor, why not have, like there was back in the 90s, a 36 millimeter version, a midsize, right? I mean, these things, like, I don't know everything, but it just seems so obvious. Like, rather than focusing on something like, again, an Apollo 8 with a moon rocket and charging $5,000 extra, just go with the trends, size down the catalog somewhat in terms of number of SKUs and just the sizing of the watches themselves. And I almost want to say, again, this is a hypothesis, watch the money roll in. What do you both think?
Well, yeah, I think that sometimes brands should listen to you, David. I do think that Longines is on a roll. Omega needs to be tidied up a little bit, but Longines could still blow this. You know, I agree with your hypothesis that Longines is in the ascendancy and Omega is maybe not keeping the pace as well as it should, but I don't think it's quite as wildly disparate as like Longines has made it and Omega is like collapsing. I think there's still time for both of these brands to turn it around. Omega for the better, Longines for the worse. I think Longines really does need to consolidate its new position and it needs to trim the fat, as it were. It needs to get rid of its lower end collections. It probably needs to go like totally mechanical, focus on its in-house movements. So I say in-house in inverted commas, but you know what I mean. They're as close to in-house movements as anything in the Swatch Group can be, I guess. And I think that would add real value to that brand. And that would make it a serious contender to Tudor. Because let's not be blind here. While Omega is moving up towards Rolex, Longines is moving up towards Tudor. And the release of the Spirit Collection and the release of something like the Zulu Time is no coincidence. Because these are now being aligned with Tudor's competitors in that bracket. There's a direct competitor right there. That makes it very, very obvious to me what Omega is trying to do. It's picked its two brands that are going to fight the fight with the Rolex and the Tudor brands, and it is positioning itself to make a firm attack on those previously unassailable positions. What Omega needs to do, though, even more than Longines, is control this sprawling collection, get it under a tight grip and say, okay, we don't need 150 Aquaterra references in every combination under the sun. That's not good branding. Yeah, those products do sell in certain parts of the world. And like the Constellation collection basically only exists because of its popularity in Asia. Perhaps even regionalize your collections just so the catalog isn't so overwhelming. Because I go on Omega's website now and I'm like, geez, I don't really know what this brand is and what I want from it. I could see both brands having success in the next 2 or 3 years if they really cut back on the references in their catalogs and they both dig their heels in at these new price points, and Omega removes a lot of its bottom end and Longines does that even more aggressively. Alon, what do you think?
I think that I love this episode and it turned out indeed splendidly. What I would love, the Hayeks, their army of half good, half less good CEOs in the boards, the extended executive committee and the management teams and whatever tiers of management they have, is to do a 180, meaning switch from shareholders, POV, point of view, to stakeholders. I don't mean by this go ecological or become sustainable. That's only one aspect. For those that like my idea, there's an amazing book out there called Donut Economy. Why am I saying this specifically for the Swatch Group and the watch industry? Shareholders' point of view is short-term. Publicly listed companies, per definition, are driven by quarterly figures, create as much dividend per stock per quarter, and therefore per year, and therefore it is automatically short-term. This contradicts long-term brand building. It can't go hand in hand. When you switch to stakeholders economy, you suddenly have a longer scope. Since Swatch Group is run like a family-owned business, whom usually have long-term visions, we solve the problem that there doesn't need to be a raider or a change of ownership or a aggressive buyout or a managed buyout or whatever. The Hayeks already are majority shareholders and they control the management. So it's in their benefit to have a long-term vision, because with that comes bigger market caps. I said it earlier, their growth was very rocky and they've never passed the 10 billion turnover. I would say, look what the Arnauds do with LVMH, or look what Rupert does with Richemont. They had bigger growths because they let their maisons run more independently and they let them compete with each other. I think, and that's maybe my closing note for today because I can go on for hours as well, I think they should let the reins go on both horses and let all the Swatch Group brands compete freely, or at least Longines and Omega. And that would be interesting what happens. And a bonus feedback, Longines, you are indeed under the helm of Matthias Breschan doing cool stuff, listening more to the community, but please bring back the historical pieces in more historical shape. Example, I love the big eye, the chronograph, but when you look at the side of the watch, you get a heart attack. That watch obviously needed a slim, hand-wound chronograph caliber. Please, please, please make that again.
All right. So I am extremely, extremely happy that this went from something that you two were skeptical about to something I think, we could fill probably 4 or 5 episodes with. A closing note is that, again, we have much more to say, but I want to hear what the listeners have to say. So drop us a line. Rob will tell you how, in the WhatsApp group. Certainly, I'm looking forward to hearing all the feedback. And don't hesitate to play CEO as well. Love to hear about what you think these two brands should do in the future.
All right, well done, David. Yes, you pulled it out of the bag, and you were absolutely right. There's plenty of meat on this bone, and I'm sure we can revisit it in the future because there's angles that we didn't even approach today. If you have any questions for us on this topic or others, then please feel free to get in touch. You can do so via our dedicated Instagram handle, that's at therealtime.show, or you can email either Alon or me at Rob or Alon at therealtime.show, or via the contact form on the website, www.therealtime.show. We'll be back soon with more articles, more interviews, and more Q&A sessions from the mailbag. Until then, stay safe and keep on ticking.